It gives me great pleasure to introduce Alia Singer. Leah is the director and founder of Entwine Limited, focusing on strategic research. But Leah trained as an architect, so has a background in infrastructure. She told me she loves the built environment and how it can change lives. And she loves big, complicated problems, when the rest of us might be trying to avoid them. Leah seems to embrace them. On Infrastructure New Zealand are delighted that Leah is going to present a commissioned report on procurement challenges across the New Zealand infrastructure sector, focusing primarily on public sector procurement, which leads, I think, quite well into when Duncan was talking about procurement centres of excellence. This is Infrastructure New Zealand's research or key research insights work for 2018. So we've decided that as an organisation this is a key priority. Hopefully we'll hear the Minister talk about it again this afternoon, so I think the timing is excellent. All over to you, Leah. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Okay, creating value through procurement. A little bit of background to this piece of research was that obviously the industry has had some issues with public sector procurement over the past probably few years, to be honest. It's been reported quite extensively in the media. And Infrastructure New Zealand recognised that there needed to be an understanding of the specifics around the issue, because procurement is it's a pretty big word. And so, long story short, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Stephen said, can you do some research? And I stupidly said yes. So that's led me to today. So I think it's important to understand how the research was conducted and the sort of levels of objectivity within that. So we had 26 participants, and that was across the private sector and the public sector, sort of chief executive, general manager level, like real leaders of industry and leaders of the public sector. We covered horizontal infrastructure, which is obviously your roads and water, and vertical infrastructure, which I think is sometimes, the term infrastructure gets a bit confusing, but vertical infrastructure in terms of social infrastructure is equally as important, and the Prime Minister, I think, touched upon that earlier today, schools, hospitals, prisons and the like. And we also looked at local government, central government, and then there's a bit of a sanity check against industry reports. So, I mean, the scope was absolutely huge, and this is a selfie I took while trying to figure the issues out. So, I think it's important to understand what actually is procurement. There's a tendency often to think of it in terms of the transactional process during the market engagement phase. But this definition is from the government rules of sourcing, and it's all aspects of acquiring and delivering goods, services, and works. And it starts with identifying the need, which is really key, like what is the problem that's actually trying to be solved. And it finishes, obviously, with either the end of the service contract, and this is important in the context of infrastructure. It's the useful life, it's at the end of the useful life and disposal of an asset. So procurement is looking at the entire investment life cycle. And so an understanding of everything within that is what you need to be thinking about when you make your decisions. So what's the problem? This is a bit of a systems diagram. These are my working drawings I'll show you of how I try to understand the problem and connect the pieces. And I think what's really important here is to understand the layers of drivers and dependencies. So along the top, we've got what is effectively the decision-making sequence. And that actually description runs fairly parallel to Treasury's investment management cycles. So you've got the context, like what is the policy environment. You need to understand why you're trying to build the asset. And I think that this is an interesting conversation, why you're trying to build the asset, because the public sector is vast with a lot of agencies, but that's carved up and compartmentalized just for their own convenience of our own digestion as individuals. But the reality is we're talking about a system, and so you need to understand why you want to build the asset, not just in the context of the individual agency needs, but in the context of the entire system. Because obviously value erosion occurs if you meet your own ends, but you create an issue or roadblock or your road value for the ends of another agency, so it's counterproductive. What's the asset gets into what's the physicality of the asset. And then obviously when we talk about delivery, we tend to talk, often I think the conversation is a little bit more towards the main contractor side, but there's a whole team that needs to be engaged for that process. And then obviously we've got the actual delivery phase occurring, and that's really kind of the end point of the research, and we didn't go into facilities management, et cetera. But if we look at the key challenges that have been identified by industry, they run effectively macro to micro, but they're all interconnected. So you go from a policy level to a systems level to a project level. And the reality is you've got what we've talked about a lot, pipeline uncertainty, you've got the issue of policy shocks, and that trouble identifying the outcomes sought as a major one. You shouldn't go past that gateway step unless there's a clear understanding of what needs to be achieved through the investment. And this feeds into the boom-bust and the uncoordinated pipeline, because there needs to be a prioritization across the system of what needs to occur. And the best way to reduce the load in the system and deal with skill shortages is to build less by making what you build more effective. So there's a real need to coordinate. And then I think that the issues around risk and value are fairly well understood and discussed a lot. You know, risk needs to be best management risk practice. And then we've got the transactional waste occurring in the tender process, the quality of the evaluation, and two interesting subsets, which was feedback about the concern over the disproportionate influence that an individual may have on the selection of a team or a company. And it sort of feeds into concerns over the high relationship basis in New Zealand and the weak balance sheets and how perhaps decision-making is not as informed as it should be. And then local versus global is a very interesting one, because the engagement with expertise offshore, or supply chain offshore, is a huge discussion in itself that we could talk about for 2 hours effectively. But there needs to be some sort of vision or guiding principles for that. And then what I think is particular interest there at the end is the culture of mistrust, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail further along. And also what I've called suboptimal, what have I called it there? Suboptimal participation, effectively, which is teamwork. It's when the public sector is seen to be not engaging as a team player. And of course, these all lead into impacts in industry, which is the disincentive to invest. We've got sunk costs, pipeline gaps. But it's amazing how many arrows flow into the delivery cost increase. But at the end of the day, those impacts on industry aren't the core concern. The core concern of the conversation is actually the impact on the average Kiwi. Because the reality is the industry in New Zealand is the average Kiwi. So if you kill the industry in New Zealand, and that's reflected in the fact that if there's too much waste or loss, or it creates firm failure in a worst case scenario, that's not faceless entities that suffer. That's New Zealanders who have no job to go to tomorrow. And then you miss the multiplier effect of the dollars in the economy. And the reality is that whenever there's so much waste in the system, for example, whenever there's sunk costs or tender waste, that's getting built back into rates. So the delivery costs are going up. But the delivery costs are going up and not necessarily adding value to the building itself in terms of better products or better quality products or systems, et cetera. So all that's going up in parallel is the whole of life cost of the asset. And what I want to touch on in particular here is this culture of mistrust and how this trickle-down effect to the negative contracts that Duncan's talked about, and also the master-servant adversarial relationships and the tension that's created. Because I think that there needs to be a much better understanding of the awful consequences that has in real people's lives. Like, men who work in the construction sector are in the highest risk category of suicide in New Zealand today. That's higher than the forestry industry. And that's from a cross-agency report that's 2 years old, based on stats which may increase because it takes a while for the coroner to understand what constitutes a suicide. That's something on its own that should be enough to create immediate action for change. And at the end of the day, whenever you have suboptimal participation in the process, you also miss all of the collaborative value add, which could get you marginal benefits, which effectively costs you very little to get value created. And again, it's a stressful environment and people will vote for their feet. So why do we have these challenges? And this is kind of getting into the root causes and the nitty-gritty of what's really important. Because unless we understand why the challenges, where they come from, how do you actually have a sustainable fix? And this is based on feedback, but I have to say the feedback is incredibly consistent, and it also correlates with industry reports as well. So we've got, obviously, maybe is the word, but political consensus, so you don't have that long-term vision to give you the certainty for the investment, et cetera, et cetera. Weak agency leadership. And this comes from the fact that all the behavioral norms within an agency are mimicked by the leaders. I mean, that's how we grow as people. You know, you copy those around you as a child, and that defines how you treat other people. And that's no different in an organization. So if you have leadership which isn't walking the walk and talking the talk of what it's like to treat people as equals, you end up with the adversarial master-servant procurement culture, which is not a team environment. And this focus cost, not value, is actually, what that actually is about talking about the delivery cost, whenever we should always be talking about the whole of life cycle cost versus the value it's created, because it's just a return on the investment. You spend X dollars on planning, designing, building, maintaining, decommissioning your asset, and you want to hope that the value it's unlocked is worth more than that. Otherwise, you haven't got any return on the investment at all. And again, that's got to be within the system context. Now, lack of agency capability at the coalface, I've called it, which is at the level of engagement directly with market. How are those people operating? What decisions are they making? And the report is 50 pages long, so this is just a bit of a taster. But there's a lot of drivers for lack of capability. But at the end of the day, the result is the same. That there's not enough individuals in the team. It's like you're trying to play football with 9 players often, because you don't have the breadth of experience, you don't have the estimators, you don't have the right legal advice, you don't have the technical understanding. And I think what was interesting, what Duncan touched on as well, is this kind of culture of fear. And this was a bit of a recurring theme in the research, because it's saying, well, why do people in the public sector that the private sector is dealing with, why is there perception that these people are so risk averse or so afraid to go outside of a lowest cost tendering model or to try different types of delivery contracts? And often it's because the fear of not getting it right. And if you operate from a platform of fear, you're unable to take on new information, and you're unable to engage in any level of innovation whatsoever. And again, that comes down from the top. So contexts need to be created that enable space for trying different things. And really, a big driver for that culture of fear, or culture of trying something different, is the fact that there's just a lack of evidence to have evidence-based decision-making. And that occurs at all levels. And that has been talked about this morning in terms of data collection. It was openly admitted this morning that people don't have enough data within agencies of what's actually going on. And Treasury are struggling, obviously, in that area as well. So the big question after that is the private sector squeaky clean? And look, the reality, no, they're not. There's been a lot of criticism received in the report research about main contractors, about how they've struggled historically to make a transition from following a set of instructions effectively to engaging in proactive type delivery models where they need to collaborate as well. But what I want to talk about for a minute is the private sector that often sort of escapes attention, which I've called behind the scenes. And those are the individuals that are actually informing the public sector in terms of decision making as well. So we're talking about cost planners, we're talking about the legal profession, we're talking about project managers. And a challenge with this is the fact that the outcomes have to be aligned in terms of whole of life cost of asset versus the value you're trying to create. People have got to be very clear on why they're in the project to begin with. But the harsh reality is that a lot of the individuals from the private sector or the entities which engage with the public sector in this context, their incentives are the traditional project management metrics of on time and on budget, and maybe to a certain benchmark quality standard of asset. But the reality is that those drivers are not the overall outcome drivers. So you immediately have a tension where you could have a private sector advising on a public sector project, which is to the detriment of the whole of life cost and value creation balance. And the outcome of all of this, with these political weaknesses of not having sufficient long-term planning and certainty, et cetera, private sector weaknesses and public sector weaknesses, is you have the perfect storm. And I certainly wouldn't want to be in that canoe heading to that. So the big question is, we know that there are high performers or better performers in the public sector. It's not tarring everyone with the same brush. So I think what we need to understand is, well, what are the key success factors and key failure factors? Why is it that some agencies seem more able to procure better when others seem to be struggling? What can we learn from that? And based on that information, we sort of build up a picture of, like, what does good actually look like? And so this diagram was created to try and understand what the essentials were that needed to work in sync to get good outcomes. And obviously, you know, the political context has been talked about quite a lot. And you need the agency leadership, but not just strong agency leadership. You need what we call transformational leadership, which is essentially the best fit for a kind of knowledge worker environment where you clearly outline the outcomes, you have everyone driving in the same direction, you allow people the freedom to think for themselves, to create new ideas, to create a team environment. And without that transformational leadership being respectful to everyone, you actually can't collaborate. Collaboration is a behavior, it's not a thing you just decide to do tomorrow. And what's really important is this enabled context, because what's quite clear from the report is the agencies that are doing quite well, they have a mastery of procurement. And mastery is like learning a musical instrument. If you practice the same thing a lot of the time, you become really good at it. So agencies that procure a lot of the same thing at a high level of frequency, and often that have a focus on the technical aspect, which tends to be horizontal infrastructure, end up being quite good procurers. And that's reflected in Wellington Water, NZTA, and Watercare. Now, the agencies that struggle the most at the opposite end of the spectrum are those who simply don't procure enough often enough. And so they have no incentive to retain the capability in-house. So of course they're not going to be good at procurement. So the expectation is that every agency that has a business as usual procurement, that they have the capability in-house. And so they will only need to top that up if it's an outside of business as usual type thing, like the district health boards or whatever, if they want to build a mega hospital or something. But what good looks like is that whenever you have those three strong central issues, you have the context or the context enabled for you, you have the political alignment, and you have the transformational agency leadership. The value is drive down through all the other levels because they're dependent on those three things being in place, and that's how you get the maximized value to New Zealanders. And the thing is, you pick up value all the way through in every step. So the industry picks up value, which flows down to New Zealanders, which flows down to better quality assets and a more sustainable construction industry. So this is a bit of a quick summary of how far we are from good. And it's difficult because the report isn't, the research wasn't a deep dive into the ins and outs of every single individual agency. But I mean, you know, political alignment has been weak effectively or non-existent. And so the outcome of that is that the industry that's dependent on that has never been able to get into the green space. Then if we look at the agency leadership and culture, that's not important just for the purpose of engaging with industry, but it's also useful or important or imperative to engage with other agencies, to find synergies, to collaborate within the public sector system. But at the moment, it's almost like that's at the discretion of an agency, or if they have time, or as an aside if they're not too busy. But that's got to become a priority because that's actually how you maximize value in the system. And what's important to understand too is the market feedback loop is broken. That the market's too afraid of reputational damage to come forward and always give feedback to allow a continuous learning loop. And that's effectively roadblocked by a master-servant culture. And then another massive one is data and tech, which was discussed as well. And unless you're able to, you can't manage what you can't measure, and unless you're able to measure the value you're creating and understand your total cost of asset and even understand your outturn cost on an asset, how can you ever get better at that? But the challenge is creating the metrics, because the reality is, I mean, the Scottish Futures Trust put it quite well. As I said, it's very easy to measure efficiency. It's very easy to know if you're getting more efficient at delivering an asset. But how do you know you're delivering the right assets? How do you measure if you're being effective? And that actually takes a lot of time and effort and understanding of the outcomes, again, to be able to do that within a system context. And you need effective checks and balances. And again, you need something that allows agency, which is short of capability, to be able to top it up when they need to. So how do we get there? A quick summary, effectively. System needs system oversight. Someone or an entity facilitate collaboration, master planning, to enable access or to provide capability, and also to monitor the system, because that's a huge weakness at present, is monitoring the system. But change also needs change management strategies, and I think that is also something that needs to be discussed a lot more. You can't just decide tomorrow, you can't mandate change, because change is how people act, the decisions they make. They've got to buy into that change, and they've got to understand what that means for them, and they've got to believe it in here. It's not enough to believe it academically. and people need help to change. And just on to reinforce that point so importantly, it's a mindset shift. It's a belief shift. It's a value set shift. And that's going to be incredibly challenging for people. But ultimately, we want to get to a situation where people do view assets as investments, not as expenses or just not as a build exercise. This needs to be an understanding that when you procure infrastructure, it's not a product or a service. You're actually procuring a team that will solve a problem for you. So don't you want to be sure you're engaging the right team? And that's reinforced by the point that the better the team, the more value you create. So the importance of individuals in this cannot be overestimated at all. And the last point is that people need to believe that synergies need to be a priority, not an aside or if I have time to do this. So if there's any takeaways from this, the conditions that must be in place to have positive procurement: vision, values, teams, tools, and tech. It literally is that simple. And I think it's really important to understand that this is good news. This is like finding a heap of money down the back of your sofa. There's so much opportunity in this space that if improvements are made, millions. And those millions can either go into new assets, or they can go into improving the quality of current assets, or they can go into whatever. But there's so much money that could be taken out, and the returns can be increased phenomenally. Thank you very much.